This one might be the nerdiest class we do this whole time, so just strap in. It's going to be maybe super fun, maybe super awkward and hard to follow. We'll find out. But welcome to the Christian history class. As always, my name's Jacob Pinnell, and we are in week 9 or 10 of this. So we have only 4 more weeks. We're ending at the end of October. So next week we're going to do the Reformation. Then we're going to do the founding of America and the Great Awakenings. And then we're going to do the Restoration Movement. And then we'll do, or maybe that founding of America and Restoration Movement will be all in one. And then we'll do modern Christianity, i.e. what is post-World War II Christianity in America. So, and that will carry us up as far as we can get to today. That leaves us actually with one extra class. So I've been thinking about what to do. If any of you all have any topics or questions or something that I haven't gone over yet, I'd love to get those from you, and maybe we'll just do a question and answer class. We'll jump all over the place. Or maybe I'll prepare something that we haven't talked about yet for that last class. Or maybe I'll get sick next week and we'll need the extra week. There's really just no telling. I always try and build in one buffer class because something inevitably happens. But if you've got a good question or something that's been burning on your mind, just let me know for that last one. And if I get a bunch of things, we'll just cover them kind of rapid fire or something like that. Last week, we spoke about the Crusades, and I wanted to speak about how I've been highlighting a Christian history that leads or ties to us in the broader sense as Western Christians, then Protestants, then as a Restoration Movement church. So one of the things I want you to remember from the Crusades is the bodies from last week. Christians were willing to put their lives on the line for God or Christianity. And that's courageous. I also want you to note that the cause of this sacrifice is often linked to the effect, and that cause for many of the Crusaders, and it might have even been a faithful response, was driven by fear or greed, and ultimately perhaps greed, which created an aggressive stance that the Crusaders fell into. So that line can kind of be followed. Fear leading to greed, where the greed is supposed to kind of alleviate that fear. But as you get greedy, you get aggressive. And when you look back at the Crusades and you look at the aftermath of them, a lot of times you see that aggression in the Crusaders. And we see this, I think, as Western Christians in our bodies today. Christians who are most afraid or anxious often fall to greed and then aggression. You can see this in some of the policies that Christians overwhelmingly support in our country today. They tend to be either fearful and then linked to an aggressive response. So I'm not going to pick anything out in particular. You can look at that and decide for yourselves. So for us in this class, do not dismiss the Crusaders as unfaithful or non-Christian. As we spoke about last week, it was in fact very Christian. Nor find them exemplary. Instead, learn from them. Find the courage to stand against the aggression. Now, this week we're going to return to the world of the mind. And we're going to look, again, I encourage you to look deeper into the stories to find faithful encouragement and love. For love drives out fear, and love leads us to faith. A faithful type of certainty rather than an enlightenment or predetermined factuality, that type of certainty. So, if the Crusades were so much about bodies, we're going to really dive into the mind this week and see how both Thomas Aquinas and Dante Alighieri shape our minds and our Christian imagination even today. As always, every week, we're starting with our rules. Rule 1, we are not covering all of Thomas Aquinas, just by himself. The Summa Theologica has 150 pages for the table of contents alone, much less the over 6,000, depending upon the translation, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 pages in a single book of his. Unfinished too. So that means he had more to say than could even be contained in those pages. We're going to skip off the just very surface level of that one book, much less the whole man's life. Rule 2, what we do cover is subject to, is going to be incomplete, subject to review and disagreement. Scholars don't disagree on all the takes that I'm presenting to you. My goal, as I have said from the beginning, is to give you guys a story to kind of latch on to and then dig deeper with. Somewhere to question. I'm not always right. I'm certainly not perfect. Please don't ever hear me saying I'm perfect or always right. Please dig deeper. Disagree with me. That's a good and healthy thing, as my training is both a scientist and that's what historians do with each other. So, in the wider world, during the time of Aquinas and Alighieri, a monumental shift has happened in the intellectual world. And that is, we have switched from the patristic period, which ends somewhere in the 800s or 900s, to the scholastic period. The scholastic period is largely seen as founded by Anselm of Canterbury, who we've talked about for several weeks, and Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard was a professor of Aristotelian logic at the University of Paris, one of the oldest non-continuous universities in the world. The oldest continuous university goes to Al-Qarawin in Fez, Morocco. They were founded in 859 and are still going on today. And then Bologna University, or the University of Bologna, was founded in 1088. Both of those are still in operation. Paris would be in that mix, but they specifically had a break during the French Revolution where they were entirely defunded. So they no longer get the continuously existing stage or kind of thing. So Peter Abelard is one of the first European teachers since ancient Rome of Aristotelian logic. And that is in large part due to the infusion of trade that happened during the Crusades and after the Crusades. The works of Aristotle specifically were recovered or translated in mostly Cordoba or Toledo, Spain. This most likely means that Peter Abelard could speak and read Arabic because he would have had to read those texts in Arabic first before joining with a friend to translate them to Latin. The text he helped translate was Aristotle's Organon, which is the categories on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and on sophistical refutations. Why is Aristotle such a big deal? Well, Immanuel Kant, someone from the 1700s, will have been quoted saying, "There was nothing else to invent in philosophy after the work of Aristotle." So, if you're talking about philosophy, even in the modern sense, you're pulling from Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's teacher was famously Plato, who came before Aristotle. So, they have a differing of opinions, which is why most philosophers take the time to become familiar with both. Even today, you're going to read the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle and at least the Republic by Plato, if not the Timaeus. So, scholasticism is a system of theology and philosophy taught in medieval European universities. Again, now we have universities. Think about the Dark Ages where we could barely build a monastery in a town 400 years ago, 600 years ago. We have universities, and these universities are still rocking it today. So that's a big shift in how the world functions, because you have these places that are both like culturally protected so people can come learn and study. And that's a big deal for humanity because it's not something that really truly exists before this time. It sort of existed in the ancient Greek philosophy, but good question.
What is the time from?
So Thomas Aquinas, it lived from 1225 to 1274, and Dante Alighieri is like 1250 to 325. So we're talking the 1200s here, is when we're really, so we're still in that like right after the end of the Crusades period, the founding of scholasticism, and some predates the Crusades. So we're in that like 1000 to 1300 time period. So we haven't quite hit the Renaissance yet, if that helps you. So the Middle Ages or medieval Europe is a strangely long period of time than what most people think. If you think of the Italian Renaissance as being the 13 to 1400s, that would make the medieval Europe like 600 to then. So that's a lot longer than I think we typically think of it as. Scholasticism focused on how to acquire knowledge and how to communicate it effectively so that it may be acquired by others. Universities, makes sense. It was thought that the best way to achieve this was by replicating the discovery process, which is more or less still how we teach today. The scholastics would book a renowned scholar and author as a subject for investigation, and after reading through them thoroughly and critically, the disciples would learn to appreciate the theories of the author. Then other documents that either agreed or disagreed and related in some way would be referenced. These could be church councils, papal letters, or anything else written on the subject, be it ancient or contemporary. The points of disagreement and contention between multiple sources would be written down into individual sentences or snippets of text. Then they go through a series of dialectics. Then the two arguments would be made whole so that they were found in agreement and not contradictory. So, if you maybe were taught this method of writing in school, where you have a thesis, you start with an argument, then you have an antithesis or antithesis, and then the third thing you do is a synthesis. This is straight out of Peter Abelard and Anselm of Canterbury, founding in scholasticism. The authors are giving lectures, not in a wholly dissimilar way to what I'm doing for you guys right now. So all of this started about 1,000 years ago, and we're still doing it today. So the way that they were synthesized was through philological analysis, i.e. the words were examined and argued to have multiple meanings. So the best example of this that I've ever heard is the word cool. So cool can mean a temperature or it can mean a social status. Two very wildly different meanings, but it kind of gets at the argument when they're looking back now 1,000 years at something maybe Cicero wrote and going, well, did he mean cool the temperature or did he mean cool the social status? And if he meant cool the social status, then the argument shapes out this way. And if he meant cool the temperature, well, the argument shapes out this way. And if we go with one of those, we get a synthesis. If we go with the other one, we get a contradiction. And so a lot of times they were really nitty-gritty on the words. The second was through logical analysis, which I also just kind of walked you through right there, which relied on the formal rules of logic as laid out by Aristotle. So scholasticism really can't happen without Aristotle. And we'll get to what was going on before then. Also in the wider world, we have what are the founding of the Mendicant orders. So on your left is St. Dominic, and on your right is St. Francis of Assisi. Mendicant orders took vows of poverty to be monks. So look at the two pictures, and I think you'll tell me who took their vow of poverty a little more seriously. But St. Dominic his main goal was not necessarily to take a vow of poverty to just give it all the way to the poor. It was to take a vow of poverty to train preachers. So at this point in history, roughly the middle 1100s, most priests could not read Latin, Greek, or maybe even their own native tongue. So how are they preaching to their congregations? Well, mostly from memory. And that's not new to the world. That's what Jewish rabbis did in Jesus' day. That's what rabbis did in David's day. But he thought this was not a great idea, that we should really learn to actually read and then teach, hopefully, from the text. And so the idea of a sermon is, while it is originally a homily, which is something that is early Christianity, the idea of the sermon as we know it today is mostly due to Saint Dominic, because he came in and taught preachers how to preach the word, mostly by learning how to read. And so they could actually read what they had in their chapel, in their monastery, in their whatever was going on. And so we have this surge now in reading to couple along with the recovery of ancient texts. And we have universities forming that kind of just overall propels the world in a different direction from the Middle Ages or the medieval world. So in many ways, we're starting to break from the medieval world and the ancient world that comes before it into something that looks a lot closer to what we have now. So let's talk about our main man for tonight. That is Thomas Aquinas. He lived from 1225 to 1274. He was born in Sicily to a well-off family, but he was one of the younger sons. And as is custom when you have born into a well-off family, if you are a younger son, so that you do not cause conflicts with the older son, you are shipped off to the church where you take your vows that you renounce all your lands and titles and everything else, unless the older son dies without an heir, basically. Like, that's the only, cop out for those. And even then, there are many cases of clergy who stay faithful to the church because they grew up in it. That's what they knew. So Thomas Aquinas was one such second son, and his nickname at the time was the Dumb Ox. So in 1254, Thomas was sent to study at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris, where he most likely met Dominican scholars. So he is a Dominican monk. Thomas Aquinas is in the order of Saint Dominic, who we just talked about. Albertus Magnus, then the holder of the chair of theology at the College of St. James in Paris. When Albertus was sent by his superiors to teach at the new Studium Generale in Cologne, in 1248, Thomas followed him, declining Pope Innocent IV's offer to appoint him as abbot of Monte Cassino as a Dominican. Monte Cassino and the abbacy was a pretty big deal. So for him to turn it down meant he was no longer going to try and move up through the order of the church. So he was no longer going to try and become a bishop or a cardinal or eventually a pope. He was going to choose the life of study instead. Which is why he followed his teacher. Albertus then appointed the reluctant Thomas Magister Studentium. Because Thomas was quiet and did not speak much, some of his fellow students thought he was slow in the mind or something like that. But Albertus, his teacher, prophetically exclaimed, "You call him dumb ox, but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it can be heard throughout the world." And he was right. I have online friends who are Thomists, and they study the Summa Theologica right beneath the Bible, and they love it. And God bless them, because, like I said, 150 pages of table of contents. It is a dry read. Now, one of Thomas Aquinas' chief tasks, or things he kind of took on, was to reconcile Augustine and Aristotle. So we have Augustine showing up once again. This is a picture I showed you weeks ago of Augustine on your left and Gregory the Great, the first pope, the first kind of true pope of Rome, on the right. And he's kind of building this bridge of Christianity. Then I showed you a few weeks ago this one of, again, Augustine on your right and Pope Gregory VII and his Reformation. So he reforms the bridge right there into something that's a little bit more medieval. This is Thomas Aquinas, and he's on the pedestal with Aristotle. So he's trying to reach across and fortify that bridge that he sees from Augustine, and he's pulling it into what is to him modern day Paris. There's Notre Dame Cathedral. It will be completed in Thomas Aquinas' lifetime. So that tells you how old that cathedral is, roughly 800 years, which is fabulous. So Aristotle and Plato, and Augustine, what's going on there? Well, Augustine's philosophy is a lot more Platonic than Aristotelian, and Augustine and Plato have their differences. So, during the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Augustinian theology. Aquinas employed both reason and faith in the study of metaphysics, moral philosophy, and religion. While Aquinas accepted the existence of God on faith, he will offer 5 proofs of God's existence to support such a belief. So, if you'll recall, we had apologetics with Origen. The apologetics of Origen was was rational, but it was borne out in action. The apologetic was a life well lived, or the good received as I live my life. Aquinas is going to shift from that into something that looks a lot more closer to the arguments we have today, where it is a purely rational kind of set of takes on it. So if you want to read one of the original proofs, like you would recognize it today, you can find it in the Summa. It's line by line in pure tedium. You go for it. One of the most significant this is Plato on your left, by the way, and that's Aristotle on your right. One of the most significant intellectual hurdles for Augustine in his conversion to Christianity was the problem of evil. His earlier Manichaean beliefs had posited a dualistic universe with 2 co-eternal and conflicting principles, good, light, and evil, darkness. Platonism, particularly through the works of Neoplatonists like Plotinus, offered Augustine a compelling alternative. He adopted the Platonic and Neoplatonic view that evil is not a substance or positive force in itself, but rather a privation of the good. So, just as darkness is the absence of light, evil is the absence of good that ought to be present. From this perspective, all of God's creation is inherently good. Evil arises not from a malevolent creator, but from the corruption of a good nature turning away from the ultimate good, which is God. So that's where, in that nature, Augustine pinpointed that as Adam being the one who made that original sin and then passed it on subsequently thereafter. But this formulation allowed Augustine to uphold the omnipotence and omnibenevolence of the Christian God while still accounting for the existence of evil in the world. So, St. Augustine's engagement with Platonism was not a simple adoption, though, of the Greek philosophy, but a critical and creative synthesis. So he didn't just go like, now I'm a follower of Plato. He's saying, this is what Plato has right, and we're going to twist together what I know of theology and Platonism together. You would be surprised how many of our main ideas that we have today originated with Plato. And Plato being Aristotle's teacher, Aristotle is not going to completely disagree with Plato. We'll talk about that in just a second. So, Augustine skillfully employed Platonic concepts as a rational foundation for Christian doctrine, demonstrating how faith and reason could be harmonized. By reinterpreting key Platonic ideas through a Christian lens, Augustine forged a powerful intellectual tradition that would profoundly shape Western thought for centuries to come. So that's why we keep going back to Augustine. So next week, when I put John Calvin on that pedestal, when we're doing the Reformation, guess who he's going to look back at? Augustine. Guess who we're not looking back at? It should be obvious where Christians should look back at. It's in the name. There you go. So we keep making a lot of similar mistakes over and over again, reforming this bridge from Augustine. So we need to pay attention in a lot of ways to understand how our own ideas about Christianity are more Plato or Augustine rather than Christ. As Western Christians, our true delineation from Eastern Christianity really begins at Augustine. And he profoundly shaped who we are and how we think about the world. Thomas Aquinas profoundly shapes how we rationalize about the world. So, the difference between Aristotle and Plato in one slide, as fast as I can possibly go. All right, so imagine you're in a cave and you're chained up and you're looking at the wall right here. What do you see on the wall? A whole bunch of shadows. Why do you see shadows? Because you've got some men, or women in this case, behind the wall holding up little stick figures, and there's a torch behind it. And outside, there is the real outside world. Plato would argue that the most real or most true thing was the outside world. The problem is there's no way to escape until you die. And so for Plato, the idea of an escape or a return to heaven, he will literally use the word we use for heaven, happens after you die. Aristotle will argue, and that's the only way you can truly understand anything, is you escape this corporeal form, and that now you have total and vast wisdom. Aristotle will argue that no, you can understand what's real by looking at the shadows. So by becoming fully human, you can understand what's going on. So if you look at these shadows over here, all the way over there, what you see are a horse and maybe a dog. Now, you can learn what a horse and a dog looks like by looking at the shadows. And if you are of keen rational intellect, you can even figure out that they are shadows. But the fact that they're shadows meant they were made from a template at some point somewhere. And there's your template right in the middle. But that template had to come from a mind or a rationality or something beforehand. And that, whatever that thing was, is real. And then you can notice the differences between the horse and the dog. So the horse has much longer legs, a much longer neck, it has a mane, it has a bushy tail, as opposed to, for different purposes, it looks like something that could be ridden on. A dog looks small, squat, probably not going to ride on a dog. And so you can rationalize your way out of the cave, according to Aristotle, not by ignoring the wall, which is what Plato would have you do. Why even bother studying the wall? It's not real to begin with. Escape to the next thing. Aristotle would say, no, look at the wall. You can learn a whole lot about the world, and you can live a better life by learning a whole lot about the world. So if you want more, I talked about a whole bunch, what was it, last fall for my John class. I'll link to that in the video. For those of you who don't know, these are all on YouTube. You can watch them all there. Oh, there's the outside. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's get into the Summa real quick. It is considered the last great Latin theology work. So everything after this is either not great or not Latin. But Thomas Aquinas wrote it all in Latin. So early in 1256, Thomas was appointed regent master in theology at Paris, and one of his first works on assuming this office was Contra Impugnates de Cultum et Religionem, or Against Those Who Assail the Worship of God and Religion. After that, he began his Summa. The primary goal of the Summa is further elaborated, but it is a comprehensive, systematic investigation of God in his relationship to creation and humankind. The entire structure of the work is designed for the clearest way possible of setting forth this sacred doctrine. So his goal was to write it for beginners in Aristotelian logic. So most of us in here are probably close to that level. We don't think that way a lot because we don't try it, but you'd be surprised at how quickly you could pick it up. If we had Dan Reeves or any of our lawyers in here, they would be at intermediate level Aristotelian logicians. Be easy peasy for them. They would understand it just like the first day of law school. It wouldn't bother them at all. So throughout the Summa, Aquinas cites patristic, scholastic, Islamic, Jewish, and pre-Christian Greek and Roman sources, including, but not limited to, the Bible, Aristotle, Augustine of Hippo, Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Ghazali, Boethius, John of Damascus, Paul the Apostle, Pseudo-Dionysius, Maimonides, the Jewish scholar, Anselm of Canterbury, Plato, Cicero, and John Scotus Erigena. So, he lines it out in 3 sections there. There's debate over whether any of them is complete or whether the first 2 are complete and he was still working on stage 3. The Thomists can argue that to their heart's content. The first section is a description of God, or as God is in himself, so God's nature and essence. The second one is as God is in the beginning of things, and the third one is at their last end, and especially of rational creatures, and it is a study of teleology, or it's like what you were designed. Teleology is the study of what you were designed to do. So, hylomorphism. So it is a study of material things. So for Aristotle, he believed things were composed of 2 things, matter and essence, or Plato's, that idea of forms. So Aristotle was in general a believer of Plato's forms. How they got there and what they did after that, they broke a lot of things. So a thing's essence is its form or natural design template. So if you think of a cast or a mold, what you get out of the cast or mold would be its material or matter. What the cast actually is the form. That's the shortest way. It can get more complex very quickly. Go ahead.
Curious, you mentioned in the works that he studied, the Bible and other things, and you mentioned Paul separate from the Bible. Is it Paul, same Paul or different Paul?
So there is Paul the Apostle. There is a wider collection of works that he probably also read from or referenced. So, for example, the end of Romans 1 is widely thought to be a compilation of the wisdom of Solomon and Baruch, I think, from a quote from both of them put together. So he would have read those things and other things like that related to Paul to make his arguments. They would have appeared like Paul that we know. It wouldn't have been a different version of Paul or anything like that. In fact, much of what we know about Paul is very much connected to this time period, even today. So if you read it and it was an odd quote, it would still sound like the Paul that you all have spent your life studying. And if not, he probably wouldn't have used it, or he would have used it as a look at what this version of Paul said, look how wrong that is, kind of thing. Is there anything more on that, Tom? Okay. All right. So let's do a quote from this, and then we'll move on to Dante because we only have 10 minutes. So it says, the philosopher, meaning Aristotle, too says of the wicked that their soul is divided against itself. One part pulls this way, another that, and after that, Thomas Aquinas concludes saying, if wickedness makes man so miserable, he should strain every nerve to avoid vice. So he's quoting the Nicomachean Ethics there, chapter 4, section 4, and that's in his question 69 on the Beatitudes. So we're talking incredibly granular in the Summa Theologica. The way that he built his rationality was he proved A, and then he proved B, and then he proved the link between A and B. And then he went back and he looked at A from a different way, and he looked at B a different way, and then he proved C. And then he proved the link between A and B, and A and C, and B and C. And you can see how very quickly this book just gets incredibly long and tedious, but written at an actual level that most people in theory should be able to follow. So we can talk more about hylomorphism or anything else later. Let's get to Dante because he's the fun one of tonight for most people. So Dante Alighieri was lived from 1265 to 1321. He was born in Florence, Italy, and he is seen by many as the founder of the Italian language. So his Divine Comedy was written in Italian first, before anything else, which is brand new to the world for a work of that caliber to be written in something not Latin. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is a monumental narrative poem charting the protagonist, who is Dante, through the three realms of the afterlife: the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, or hell, purgatory, and heaven. He is guided first by the Roman poet Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, which if you want to nerd out on that, you can, through the 9 circles of hell, where sinners face eternal retribution, and up the 7 terraces of Mount Purgatory, where souls are cleansed of the 7 deadly sins. Dante witnesses the justice and mercy of God, finally in the Paradiso, where the poet Beatrice guides him through the 9 celestial spheres of heaven, culminating in a direct vision of God. And it's a journey representing the soul's path from sin and confusion towards divine knowledge and ultimate salvation. The best compliment Dante thought he ever got on this was when someone called it the Summa in verse. So the Summa Theologica heavily influenced this poem, and you will find the theology between the two are very similar. They just one is in a poem and in Italian. So what we should talk about first, I think, I didn't go to that. I'm sorry. That's a much more fun picture. So that's Dante in the middle, and that's the Inferno on your left, the Purgatory in the middle, and then the Divine Realms on the right, I think. Yes. Sorry. So let's talk about Hades or Sheol, because none of those things is exactly existing in early Jewish theology. So Hades is broken into 3 things. The first one is Tartarus, which strongly correlates to the Inferno. The second is the fields of Asphodel. This is a picture of what Tartarus could look like. It looks green and gloomy, and there's a whole lot of torture going on in there that's not pictured. The fields of Asphodel were once described by a Greek studier of ancient Greek stuff as white fields in Kansas. It's just white and colorless, and not much goes on there. And you can pick the grain up and eat it in the afterlife if you need to do that, but it's just flat whiteness. So that's Asphodel. And the third one would be Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, where the heroes go after they die. So Hercules, if he isn't turned into a god at the end of his stories, he would go to the Elysian Fields. So you very much have a hell, middle, heaven idea. And that's straight out of Hesiod's Theogony, which predates Plato. And so you can see how the ideas that the Greeks had strongly influenced what's going on here, even today. So here is the Inferno with this is by Sandro Botticelli, so this is a part of the Italian Renaissance, and it is a beautiful painting, and it's massive in person. So here are your levels of hell. At the top, you have limbo, then lust, gluttony, greed, wrath. There's the city of Dis in the middle, heresy, and then violence, and it's broken down into 3 different levels, and then fraud, which is broken down into several different levels. There's the counselors of fraud, which drop you down even lower, and then there's the treachery all the way at the bottom. In general, the idea is that over time, mankind would, if you died, you would eventually work your way up after so many years of torture in each place. So if you did treachery, you had to climb the whole gambit to get all the way up there. That is a long way to go. Ooh, we got 5 minutes. All right. Purgatory. So this is for anyone not sent to hell. So if you'll notice the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, it says the excommunicate. So you may have lived a faithful life and got excommunicated a faithful enough life to not go to hell and still gotten excommunicated, which is an interesting thing. Then there is the late repentant, or those who repented right after they died. After that comes Peter's gate, where Peter's got the keys. You get to meet him in the poem. And then you have the 7 terraces of purgatory proper. The first one is pride, where souls are weighed down by heavy stones, forcing them to walk hunched over until they have sloughed off the pride in their body. Terrace 2, envy, where souls have their eyelids sewn shut, reflecting the blindness of envy until envy has dropped from their eyes. 3, wrath. Souls are enveloped in a thick, blinding smoke until the wrath has been cleansed of them from the smoke. Sloth. Souls constantly run and rush around, reflecting their former sluggishness and pursuing virtue. 5, avarice or prodigality, which is greed and wastefulness. So think of prodigal son where he's wasteful. Souls lie face down on the ground, symbolizing their excessive focus on earthly goods. 6, gluttony. Souls suffer from intense hunger and thirst, walking past fruit-laden trees they cannot touch. 7, lust. Souls walk through a wall of raging fire. And the summit is the earthly paradise, which is depicted as the Garden of Eden, or a place of final cleansing and preparation for a soul's ascent through heaven, where Virgil will depart from Dante and Beatrice will take over as his guide. So, if you think of indulgences from the Catholic era, you could spend thousands of years in purgatory. It makes sense that you would want to drop some of those years off so that you don't have to, for that many years, have a rock on you, or be blinded, or look at the ground, or walk past trees that you can't eat from. So the Catholic Church is going to lean into this very hard, and the Reformers will try and lean out of it for purgatory kind of exclusively. They're still pretty big fans of the Inferno part, and less so of the Paradiso. The last one is the Paradiso. So the first heaven is the moon or the inconstant. So this is for those who failed to keep their vows, often through no fault of their own, representing a deficiency in fortitude. The second heaven, Mercury, is for the ambitious, those who did good, motivated by a desire for earthly fame and honor, representing a deficiency in justice. The third heaven was Venus. Notice these are actually like planets. So he was like, think about how the church was looking out at the stars and thinking and imagining this. It's the lovers, those who were given to earthly love, but which was ultimately redirected to divine love, representing a deficiency in temperance. Fourth heaven, the sun, is for the wise. These are the great theologians and the doctors of the church, representing prudence. So now we're going to switch into things that are kind of good. The fifth heaven is Mars, and these are the warriors of the faith, those who died fighting for Christianity, representing fortitude. So imagine you're coming out of the Crusades, how important it is to capture this vision of Christianity, where you are above the scholars. You are closer to God in heaven than the scholars if you went to go fight in those crusades. And how important it will be to get them to continue fighting, particularly in the Reconquista. The seventh heaven, or sixth, is Jupiter, and that is for just rulers, the souls of kings or leaders who exemplify justice on earth. The seventh heaven is for the contemplatives, those who dedicated their lives to religious contemplation. The eighth heaven is the fixed stars, or the triumphant church, where the souls of Christ, Mary, and the apostles, and they will eventually test Dante on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. So you start to pick up those threads where you go, oh, those are like our theological virtues even today, faith, hope, and love. Ninth heaven is the primum mobile, or the angelic hierarchy. This is the fastest moving sphere, or the source of motion for all others, and the realm of the 9 orders of angels. Lastly is the empyrean, or the abode of God and the blessed. So the reason why you have the angels on the outside is they are to protect everyone else from the presence of God. It's also to give God a way to move things in the first place. One of Aristotle's key questions was, what started everything? Like, what started it all? Plato had a slightly different idea. It's called the prime mover. in Aristotelian logic, or the unmoved mover. What's the first thing that kind of set off all the motion of the universe? For Thomas Aquinas, and I think he could have read this in John, as I talked about in my class, the prime mover was God. The unmoved, the unseen, the original mover was God, but God's glory was so great that they had to have a buffer of angels before he started moving all the humans in the other levels of heaven. So I think that was the second bell. So if you have any questions, please come up and talk to me. But remember, the goal here is to begin to see how our imagination is not so different. We want to argue rationally for the existence or the truth of God in a very similar way to the way Thomas Aquinas does. And we imagine our Christian journey, especially if we imagine our Christian journey as a getting to heaven, a path to get away from heaven, or get to heaven and away from hell, in very similar circumstances to the way Dante will put it in the Divine Comedy. Next week, we're going to do the Reformation. We're just going to focus on Martin Luther and John Calvin. If Martin Luther didn't start it, John Calvin would be the more important one to us personally as Americans. If we were German, it would definitely be Martin Luther. But as Americans, it is John Calvin who has the larger impact on us. So we'll spend a little bit more time on him so that you can see how his theology shapes our theology today. So again, if you have any questions, come on up and ask me. Thank you all for being here.